I've owned my Lamborghini Gallardo Superleggera for around 3.5 years. However, I have now sold it, and at the time of recording, it's actually with its new owner. So for those of you who are vaguely interested, I thought I'd go through why I sold the car and my thoughts about the ownership experience, and whether it's the type of car that you might consider for yourselves if you're in the market for a supercar. And let me know your thoughts about the Lamborghini Gallardo Superleggera or any of these cars in the comments below. And I'd be interested to hear what you think I should replace it with when I eventually get around to doing so. So let's start off with why I've sold the car. And there were several interrelated reasons for doing so. And it's not because the car was bad or because I wanted to get rid of it, but it's simply because I had better uses for the money and a deal came around that made it worthwhile actually selling the vehicle. So in terms of uses for the money, well, there are really two overarching ones. First, I was doing some large renovations of a house in Sydney's eastern suburbs. The money was better spent on those renovations than locked up in a vehicle, bluntly. Secondly, it would be useful to get that money for setting up my own business, which is a fund management business. My background is in finance, and I've been looking to, for quite some time, set up a fund focused on equities with a derivatives overlay. However, setting up a fund costs money. You have to pay lawyers, accountants, etc., etc. So selling the car unlocked some capital with which I could use to go and set up that fund. And then when that's ultimately set up, the goal is to be able to go out and buy another car at that point in time. Now that fund doesn't yet operate. The goal is to be operational over the next few months. And I'll include a link in the description below for anyone who wants to stay up to date with that fund when it is ultimately set up. But I'm definitely super excited to be able to set up my own company. Second, I received an offer that allowed me to sell the car for a bit of a profit. If I'd held on slightly longer, I maybe could have sold it for another $10,000 or so, based on the price of a car that sold just after mine. However, that car had been sitting on the market for at least a year, so they'd been waiting a very, very long time to sell their vehicle for just over what I sold mine for. And there was no guarantee that I would have been able to sell mine versus the other car. Potentially when both were on the market, we would have been driving down each other's prices. In any case, it sold at a reasonable price to me. I also knew that over the next 12 to 18 months, that some additional maintenance was going to come online. So perhaps another $10,000 to $20,000 of maintenance, none of which was urgent, but which would need to be done at some point in time. And of course, the buyer factored that into the cost that he was going to pay for the car, but still it was something that I would otherwise be out of pocket for. And again, I simply had better uses for the money. Third, Huracan prices have been falling, and it looks like they are going to keep falling down a little bit. And this will ultimately crunch Gallardo prices. I know that the Superleggera is a great edition of the car. However, there are lots of special editions. You have the Performante, which is similar to the Superleggera, but it's a convertible. Furthermore, you've got the STS, which is much more rare, however, again, is more desirable. Then you've got the other editions, such as the Balboni or the Tricolore, various other things that have come out, which mean that the Superleggera, while one of the best special editions, certainly is not the only special edition. And with Huracan prices falling, that is going to crunch Gallardo prices more generally, and will bring down Superleggera prices with that. Now, I know that some people say that the Superleggera is somewhat like the Challenge Stradale, or like the Scuderia, and it should stay higher in price, potentially trade for more than a base Huracan, be more desirable than that. And in many cases, it could be more desirable than a Huracan that is being trashed. However, many people are just going to look at Huracan versus Gallardo and not really know very much about those special editions. So it's always a bit of an uphill battle to find a buyer for a special edition at a high price, particularly with the Lamborghinis, particularly given that outside of Australia where I'm based, the gap between a base Gallardo and a Superleggera is not really that large compared with the gap between a base 360 and a Challenge Stradale, for example. So I'm not necessarily sure that that price gap will keep increasing that much. And certainly, the Superleggera would not trade for any more than a Huracan Performante, which objectively is simply a better car. Now, I will note that the Superleggera is a rare-ish car, it is desirable, but it always would face that challenge. Furthermore, my car had over 50,000 kilometers on its odometer, which means that it was really above collector edition kilometers. For collector editions, you're trying to get them really low editions, and if you're going to try to get that massive gap between the Challenge Stradale and the 360, you're often looking for a low kilometer or a low mileage car. And mine simply wasn't. It was overall in good condition. It had been well maintained, of course, with some maintenance requirements, but it simply wasn't a low kilometer car. And the new buyer looks like he's going to drive it quite a lot, so it's unlikely to remain a low kilometer car at all, relative to any other car of that age. So those overall are why I sold the car. I was offered a reasonable price for it, a price that I was not necessarily super happy with, but certainly an okay price, and I had better uses for the money, and knowing the use of the money with my own business, I'd be able to come back and buy another one in the future. Simply, it was a better reallocation of capital. But of course, different people may have different priorities, and maybe have felt that the car would be better for them. It really depends on what you would be doing in that situation. Now, in terms of my ownership experience, well, I'll talk about the cost of ownership, I guess, separately, to avoid this video becoming too long and drawn out and a little bit turgid. However, in terms of the ownership experience, it's been extremely good overall. It is not a perfect ownership experience, but it was overall very good. I had few maintenance issues throughout my ownership. I had to replace the clutch, which was probably the most expensive thing that I paid for. I didn't have any other major repairs. However, I did have to replace things like auto sensors, ignition coils, and tires, and brake pads. The usual types of things. The auto sensors were because I had an aftermarket exhaust on it, and that necessitated replacement of the auto sensors. Now, overall, therefore, it was pretty cost effective to own, although obviously I was facing some additional expenses over the next 12 to 18 months. The servicing can be either really expensive or relatively affordable, depends on where you go. So if you go to the actual dealership, servicing ends up being quite expensive, and they often want you to do more maintenance than might really be required. So it can become quite an expensive venture. But if you go to some quality third-party mechanics, and you have to find a quality one, the maintenance can be quite cost effective. But emphasis here, you have to go to the right place. Because if you go to the wrong place, it could end up being a bit of a disaster. Now, the driving experience and ownership experience overall was good, however, again, was not perfect. Now, given that I'm making this video myself, I can hardly really show a video of the car driving. So you'll kind of have to take my word for it. And some of the things that I'm describing, you really actually have to drive the car to experience. The downsides were at low RPMs and in stop-start traffic, such as the inner city, the car is not brilliant. It's a little bit sluggish when it's at low RPMs and just coming from a dead stop. It is much more responsive than the first generation Gallardo, but it still has some issues. The turning circle is also not great, and the car feels heavy, particularly at low RPMs. It doesn't feel as nimble as I think it really ought to. But if you get the rear-wheel drive version, and admittedly there's no rear-wheel drive Superleggera, but if you do a rear-wheel drive conversion, it would be much more nimble, but I didn't end up doing that on this particular car. On highways, the car is much more fun, feels a lot more responsive when it's at speed, and the exhaust sounds phenomenal. And the exhaust is such that you don't necessarily even miss having quality radio or quality speakers in the car, because it does actually sound really good. Let's take a listen to what the car sounds like, admittedly, actually while it is at a standstill. So based on the ownership experience, I will thoroughly miss the car. It has been very, very fun to drive. It's had relatively few issues. I didn't fear something breaking every time I took it out, as compared with the first generation Gallardo that I owned, and I enjoyed it a lot more than the first generation Gallardo. But again, your mileage might vary if you were to go out and buy one of these vehicles. A lot of it depends on the quality of the car, but the second generation is much better than the first generation. Now, in terms of what I might replace the car with, well, I haven't really decided at the moment, and I am using the money at the moment really in terms of starting up that company. At the moment, I've bought an old Mercedes E350, which was a cost-effective buy and is great as a daily driver getting me around. In terms of other exciting cars to buy, we'll have an expression of interest deposit on whatever the replacement for the Huracan is going to be, which may or may not be an exciting car. I'm not necessarily super thrilled about it being a hybrid, because I don't want to have to deal with the maintenance of a hybrid. It might be great to drive, but the maintenance might be really annoying and or really expensive. I'm waiting to see what that's like. If I don't go with that one, then I might reach out to some Huracan Performante owners that I happen to know, and if they are upgrading their car, I might look into acquiring a Huracan Performante. Or if I don't get a Performante, I'll probably just get a relatively cheap Huracan, because a lot of the Huracans start to blur together, given the sheer number of editions of these that have come out. But I would be interested to hear your thoughts about what to replace it with in the comments below. There's a few options that are floating around. I'm inclined toward just going with a Lamborghini due to general reliability, general ease of ownership, and the like, and my familiarity with the brand, and also the very, very good experiences I've had with the dealership, which have made ownership and life very pleasant. I would, in theory, consider some used Ferraris, but I'm less familiar with that, and I would need to do a little bit more research about which ones to consider. Another possibility could be a Porsche 911 GT3 RS, maybe from about the 2016 area. They've really come down in price. They seem quite reliable. They are reportedly very good to drive. They are probably one of the more exciting Porsches. I'm not really that into the 911s, but the GT3 RS is great. But at this stage, I haven't really made any moves on the next car at the moment, and I'm very much open to suggestions. So overall, that's a bit of an update about my ownership experience with the Gallardo Superleggera, why I ultimately sold the car, and my thoughts about what I might potentially replace it with. Let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below, of course. And thanks a lot for tuning in.